The War Years. A thin shaft of moonlight still lay over the woods when the artillery opened up with its heavy barrage. It was 5 a.m., but as of yet the infantry appeared to have encountered little resistance. In fact, nothing much of interest occurred unless one speaks of the sudden appearance of a Corporal Anton Kubica, who, wearing a brown pot-like Polish helmet and accompanied by one of our men, came striding down the sand road with a machine gun slung over his shoulder. He and his equipment soon became the centre of a crowd of curious soldiers. He was a Volksdeutscher from Lunlinitz, born coincidentally on August 1st, 1914, and one of the very first to voluntarily cross over to our lines. Volksdeutscher were Germans who were Germans in language, culture and spirit, but lived in countries other than Germany. The excitement grew when behind Teichwalde, somewhere to the south of the village, a heavy-caliber field gun battery began its rapid fire, the thundering sound of which brought the frightened villagers out into the street, who, with all earlier calm and confidence gone, now made a desperate move to flee the village. At about 9 a.m., in brilliant morning sunshine, the company command post moved to the southern entrance of the village of Glinica, which was already some 4 kilometers inside Polish territory. Crowds of villagers had gathered at the roadsides, some fearful, some happy, and some even giving us a nervous wave. This village was much poorer and dirtier than the villages in Upper Silesia, but, when later compared to villages in central Poland, it would have been judged a very pleasant place. There was no damage to be seen, although to the south a Polish demolition crew had blown a huge crater in the crossroads, a hole that was however quickly filled by the combined efforts of villagers, soldiers and labour units who formed a human chain and were depositing the entire production of a nearby brickworks into the crater. Other Polish demolitions forced us to take a detour through the village of Lubecko. While in Glinica, we received orders to lay a telephone line to the divisional observation post of Major General von Haase, who was later military commander of Berlin at the time of the failed attempt to kill Hitler on the 20th of July 1944. He was deemed complicit in the plot and hanged, which stood in the knee-deep dirt of a potato field some 100 meters to the south of the village, but from where an unobstructed view was had over the entire attack zone from the railway cutting to the east and the woods to the west. Despite the haze, we had a good view over the valley towards a line of Polish bunkers on the opposite hillside, and onto the town itself. And only later, when straw and hay barns in the village began to burn, was the horizon obscured by smoke. Roughly 200 meters in front of us, several fountains of earth suddenly erupted. The general demanded to know who was responsible. The reply came back: Polish artillery. About this time, my driver Holzenkampfer took me up to the village of Lubecko, where from a church, standing on a high point towering over the low-slung cottages, I could observe the last remaining assault battalions disappear from view and watch the arrival of reserve units approaching the road to my right. The movement of the latter was as smartly and smoothly executed as on any peacetime manoeuvre, and I could not help feeling a certain sense of pride. In the village, however, mass confusion reigned which, upon closer examination, stemmed from an overall urge by all units to keep moving forward, and in doing so they were all getting in each other's way. In the midst of this traffic jam, made up of rifle and machine gun infantry, mounted machine gun companies and horse-drawn signals units, I happened upon the regimental commander, Colonel Schmidt, with whom I was familiar from our time in Carlsbad. Thin, short in stature and with a noticeable limp, he was striding purposefully behind his 2 battalions, followed closely by his harried adjutant. By this time both battalions had covered approximately 10 kilometers deep into enemy territory. At some point, I saw the medics were already hard at work. These were men selected because of strength of character, steadfastness under fire, knowledge of weapons and equipment, and organizational skills, all of which had to be learned in just a few short years of hard preparation. The first sight of the wounded became a defining moment for many of us, at which point the inevitable question was asked: are we truly up to the task ahead? The village street of Glinica offered a much-changed scene. It had become a dusty, heavily used route to the front. On one side lay the wounded awaiting evacuation. These first images of motionless bundles lying side by side filled us with a strange sense of curiosity. Although we were pleased with the speed of the attack, a few technical failures remained cause for concern and differences of opinion, as we attempted to keep up with the regiment in our telephone cable laying task. Peacetime exercises had clearly prepared us poorly for laying telephone lines through dense woods over 30 kilometres of sand tracks, and still keep contact with the fast-paced advance. To our disgust, regimental staff ordered our exhausted telephone line laying crew to take up the lines again. It soon became clear that had we not done so, the availability of telephone cable would have quickly been exhausted, so on the second day of the advance, radio contact was established as an alternative, and during the course of a single night and day, 2 motorized vehicles recovered the full length of our cable. On the following day, the order came to prepare a new divisional command post at the edge of a wood, a kilometre north of Kochanovich. We edged our way towards the new site through a suffocating dust cloud, found ourselves jammed in with other units, and on one occasion had to wait hours while 1 or 2 unlucky trucks were removed from having fallen through a poorly constructed bridge. Along the stretch of road connecting Lublinitz and Teichwalde lay a weakly defended line of bunkers where the enemy had also carried out extensive road, rail and bridge demolition. On a level where the road reaches the edge of the wood, units of the retreating enemy had been cornered, and in the ditches and the potato fields lay the dead and the wounded. The dead sometimes frozen in an almost lifelike upright position. One corpse in a ditch to my right lay face up with his tunic brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Shattered vehicles and dead horses presented us with a dark and terrifying scene leading to many questions. Why were there suddenly so many dead in this sector, and why did side-entry horses' wounds emit a red bubbling foam? And so much more. During the night and in the early morning, the company found the time to take on the difficult task of dismantling the large U-shaped cable network and, in doing so, made itself ready for further deployment. It was a remarkable achievement for the 6-man team in recovering the many kilometres of telephone cable when having to cross unknown enemy territory without the benefit of maps and in vehicles that needed to be frequently diverted around soft sand and bog. During the same morning, I had the opportunity to explore the Kochanovich estate until 1918 Kochnovitz and found that everything down to the last stick of furniture had been removed. I felt sad knowing that now the buildings were vacant. They were almost certain to be plundered and destroyed. I was also gripped by anger at the evil power of propaganda, which sought to make us the victim by suggesting that it was us who were about to be attacked. Who was the true aggressor? German soldiers were now spilling their blood in the firm belief they were denying the Poles the opportunity of striking across the German border, and yet here were peaceful country folk forced to abandon house, hearth and livestock to save themselves from us. At midday, the company split into platoons and began to move up to the next front-line command post. Infantry Regiment 72 and 42 were by now the most advanced elements along the Alexandria, Trupizuvi line, which ran some 10 to 12 kilometres to the east. It was just a matter of hot pursuit, which, however, put heavy pressure on men and equipment, and no sooner had we crossed over the broad Czenstoch highway near Lisau in the Lisati Valley than we were subjected to the same debilitating traffic jam and dust clouds of the previous day. Vehicles, bumper to bumper, moved a few feet and then came to a stop in the heat of the day, before gaining another few steps. To our left and right, silhouetted against the blue August sun, stood a row of red pines barely moving in the afternoon heat. None had been uprooted or shattered by gunfire, yet all telegraph poles, bridges, railway lines, stations and road overpasses had been skillfully and thoroughly demolished by the retreating Poles. Most obstacles and felled trees were quickly swept aside. However, one particular location gave us an interesting challenge. We had crossed the rail line near the village of Herbie-Slasky and were approaching the tiny hamlet of Trepizui, at which point the parallel running railway line running high up along an embankment closed with the road for a distance of some 70 metres before both crossing over a river. Whereas the fairly insignificant road bridge had been blown up, the railway bridge had remained curiously still intact, so that all our vehicles were compelled to drive up the rail embankment, bump along the tracks for about 400 metres before descending again to the road below. This was the route taken by all our divisional motorised units, including the General's car and the giant divisional staff omnibus. However, even as we bumped along from one railway tie to the next, we could see that the engineers were already well on their way to completing an emergency river crossing. Nonetheless, We were sharply reminded of how the Poles had adhered to the accepted military practice of keeping a watch on blown bridges and well-laid obstacles, for while the engineers, many bare-chested and in waist-high water, were busy clearing away the remains of the demolished bridge, a rain of machine-gun fire descended upon them from buildings about 30 metres away. The result was like that of a fly-swatter striking a cluster of flies, and our response was immediate. Hand grenades were tossed into the buildings until they began to burn, and anyone running out was promptly gunned down. At Trupizui we turned south and reached Kopalny, which lay in the centre of the zone of attack. The divisional staff command post had been set up on a level sandy embankment in a small pine copse to the west of the village. It was a location that offered an almost unobstructed view from east to southwest and beyond to the zone of attack south of Częstochow. The country was generally flat, with small woods and tree-lined fields bordered by ditches running through a more or less monotonous landscape. The village consisted of the ubiquitous shingle-covered log homes, which reminded me very much of Russia and Lithuania, where, I vividly recall, the houses were surrounded by picket fences and a colourful splash of sunflowers. With the arrival of darkness, the horizon flared up in numerous locations, but there was no fighting in the neighbourhood of our battle position, even though the artillery kept up a lively barrage all night. On one of my nightly visits to a neighbouring regiment, I had, at the entrance to the village Konipsku, the opportunity to help a signals officer extricate his vehicle from the soft sand. It was also along this 10-kilometre desolate stretch of road, surrounded by dark birch woods, where the supply columns, either motorised or horse-drawn, despite exhaustion of man and beast, worked their way forward during the course of the night hours. In my estimation, these columns were still some 10–15 kilometres behind their respective forward units, and were unlikely to reach the front in time for the renewed assault in the morning. From one of these supply columns, which had come to a standstill, we learned that there was a hold-up ahead crossing the Konopka River, just to the south of the village of Wojgora. The day was Sunday, September 3rd, the day France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. That night, civilians, perhaps with the help of soldiers, had destroyed the crossing at the old mill, a building that subsequently burned to the ground, making it necessary for our engineers to hastily erect an emergency crossing, which enabled the infantry and artillery to continue moving up, however. When a couple of heavy prime movers arrived, the emergency bridge promptly collapsed and had to be repaired and strengthened yet again. While this was being carried out, there was some shooting and 2 ambulances roared in from the front with an agitated NCO, who cried out how they had been shot at from houses just up the road. A patrol was immediately dispatched, and when we moved up some hours later, we came upon the desolate scene of numerous dwellings burned to the ground with only brick chimney stacks and blackened stoves, as evidence of families who had once called these places home. In the gardens and yards lay dirt-encrusted bundles, which were the dead, most of whom were barefoot, or wore threadbare shoes without socks, and were surrounded by patiently waiting chickens, and even the occasional cow or pig. Even before we crossed over the river, we spotted the Luftwaffe following the progress of our advance from high above. No sooner had we heard a machine gun rattle overhead than all eyes were raised to the sky, and, in the haze of the sun, we espied an airplane coming at us in a wide curve with 2 German fighters hard on its tail. The fighters, possessing greater speed and agility, soon caught up with the biplane, and there followed a short burst of gunfire before the fighters pulled up and disappeared from view. Fascinated, we watched the slow, defenceless biplane try to reach Częstochow, when a short glow first emerged from its engine, followed by a ball of fire. The Polish plane disappeared behind the trees, and a few seconds later, a pall of black smoke rose up from where it had hit the ground. On our continued march, much against expectation, there was little enemy action, and our column crossed the flat heath-like landscape, where to our left the distant towers and white church of Częstochow flickered in and out of view. Then once again we found ourselves in a built-up area where men, women and children, stunned by our sudden appearance, stood in their doorways and watched us go by. Our new command post lay roughly 5 kilometres south of the town, which was reached around 3 p.m. This position lay on the west side of the River Wart, and gave us a clear view over the valley and the high riverbanks to the east, where in the late afternoon sunshine we spotted high rocky outcrops and the ruins of a castle which seemed curiously out of place in this open Polish countryside. That evening, I made my way into Chenstochau to make contact with the regiment's horse-drawn supply columns. There I found the streets full of people conducting lively and cheerful conversations with several German soldiers. This was especially true of the girls. From a purely military standpoint, it had become obvious that much of our training was completely inadequate. One company, for example, assigned with the transportation of bread and beer, had pulled in with all lights blazing. The men, it seemed, were completely ignorant of the possibility that every window and house facade along the full length of the street could easily have been the site of a deadly ambush. They had no idea where their battalion was, and no way of knowing where the regimental command post was, but for them it was all a great big adventure. In the big square in the centre of the town's east-west axis route, there was a frenzy of activity with an endless procession of units passing through to the front. My return proved easier than expected, and was accomplished by driving through the dark, empty streets of an almost endless industrial area and worker suburbs. In Rzosoje, from where most civilians had fled, a large collection of chickens and geese were discovered, and with our own mobile kitchens nowhere to be seen, there emerged from among the men a number of talented cooks who, inside an hour, had prepared the very best of soups. On the darker side, while searching the town, we came upon a group of people, most of whom appeared to be recently released convicts, who, while hiding in cellars, attics, and under bridges, were discovered to have dynamite in their possession. The divisional judge-advocate conducted a brief investigation, following which the accused were ordered to dig their graves. The rest was taken care of by the military police, who were quickly assuming greater skill at carrying out their new tasks. A similar punishment was meted out to an old woman who, when caught stealing washing, foolishly allowed herself to be persuaded to throw a stone at the arresting soldier. On Monday the 4th of September, we crossed over the river Warta at Rzosoje and reached the edge of the woods, where we found ourselves in knee-deep sand and breathing in pure chalk dust. I thought the surrounding barren fields would not have looked out of place amongst the dunes of Morocco, a bleak scenery interrupted only by the occasional cluster of pine trees. We drove through the village of Olsztyn with its primitive clapboard houses, and on up through the steep chalk cliffs where remnants of another castle were found. I would have loved to have remained there for a while to soak up the extraordinary contrast between the shabby, impoverished present-day community and its obviously once wealthier distant past. The castle grounds were on a hill at a height of about 300 metres where, with the sun hidden by clouds, the air was cool and dry. With my appetite for local history barely sated by the very brief geographic comments found on the map, we continued on through what appeared to be the foothills of the Carpathians, on a road that led us through undulating country dropping off slightly towards the north. Gradually, the chalk landscape gave way to sparsely cultivated fields and the first grey villages. On either side of the road, long columns of refugees came towards us, moving on foot along the verges and ditches. They were young and old, all exhausted, dirt-encrusted, some barefoot, many carrying their filthy bedding and other meagre possessions on their backs. Now and then, someone of slightly greater means could be spotted in their midst, such as a girl with shoes and stockings, or a man with a tailored coat, although all were unshaven, wore no tie or collar, and eyed us darkly. Whenever we encountered a cart or wagon, it was always so hopelessly overloaded with people and belongings that the exhausted horses appeared to be at the point of collapse. In the middle of this misery of tears and crying babies were corpulent, well-fed priests who allowed themselves to be carted along by their flock. To dismount and give up a seat to one of the tottering old women struggling along on foot would have been completely beneath their dignity. This description of refugees would in all probability have fitted refugees of all countries. In 1940, the French and Belgians, and much later in 1945, the Germans themselves. At about 10 a.m. the company reached the pre-established divisional command post near the village of Wielki, a place that presented a sobering image on that cold morning. Most of the place consisted of little more than blackened chimney stacks reaching up into the sky. However, in one part of the village, which happened to be still largely intact, the signals company was busy searching empty farm buildings. There must have been bitter fighting that morning, because all about lay pathetic bundles of dead men, most of whom lay face down, bringing to mind the expression of describing a dead soldier as one who has bitten the dust. We were on the verge of entering an open piece of terrain between farms. when suddenly nearby a whole row of houses was struck by a thunderous artillery barrage which threatened to engulf us in flames, heat and smoke. Luckily the wind blew the flames away from us, so we escaped the conflagration and hurried on in the wake of the division, bypassing a number of buildings of more solid construction, where returning refugees threw up their hands and wailed pitifully as we drove by. At one spot, an old woman lay dying beside the road with the usual bundle of bedding beside her, upon which a dog lay asleep, seemingly undisturbed by anyone or anything. Our next divisional headquarters were on the estate of Mokresh, which apparently had only just been evacuated. The main house offered a pleasing, simple yet clean impression. The furniture, pictures and library gave evidence of good taste and a strong sense of tradition, and altogether the place had an atmosphere of proud Polish history with a strong French influence. Here the company settled in and lived off the abandoned poultry and other supplies the former occupants had left behind, including vegetables in the big gardens. Added to that, the sun came out, filling us all with new-found warmth and making our view from the hill out over the endless expanse bright and friendly. On the evening of the 5th, I was abruptly handed a notice requiring my written acknowledgement of a Führer decree forbidding marriages to foreigners. It was from that moment on that I saw my existence in German uniform as quite repugnant. No longer did I care to be a soldier, but instead I wanted to remove myself as far as possible from the inflexible clutches of the army. On the evening of the 5th of September, the advance continued. The division had been overtaken on both flanks and had fallen back to the level of the second wave of the assault. As a result, we were told to remain where we were and to leave the first line of attack to the tanks and motorized elements. With the arrival of darkness, we moved out of the village of Mokresh, whose inhabitants were streaming back in large numbers, and set off with a motorized unit down the main road east towards Święta Anna, then on to Koniecpol before descending onto lesser roads at Dąbrowa Zielona and pulling into the town of Lionetniki. Because we had gone on ahead, we found ourselves having to wait several hours under a brilliant moon, which cast its bright light over old lime trees of the Zin estate and shot thin white beams between the darkened tree trunks. Behind a crumbling wall, I sensed there was another castle which, however, remained unexplored, because I had orders to keep the crossroads open and was sent on ahead to the assigned road junction. There, hour after hour, I watched the dark shadows of motor vehicles, horses-drawn traffic pass me by along with columns of infantry, almost dead on their feet. Occasionally a soldier on a bicycle would fall asleep and crash in a heap into the ditch. There were also frequent unofficial halts, while exhausted men, having fallen to the ground, disentangled themselves from their mess kit and the equipment of the man in front. The moon sank lower, the light thrown up by burning villages to our rear grew fainter, and then from somewhere in this desolate corner, faintly but clearly, a rooster crowed. It was the first sign of a new day. At sunrise, the three of us returned to the company where, following a long wait, we continued our advance. The reason for the delay was finally revealed to us. It had to do with the difficult terrain of our advance route, and the division had to work out a whole new plan of assault. First that night we proceeded due north for a short stretch before turning east, where we had heard of wild rumours concerning a Polish cavalry breakthrough. Not deterred, we advanced via Mausin to Pilica, where we turned north again. The route here, too, took us through woods, soft sand and bog, which not only added to the wear and tear of our vehicles, but also to excessive fuel consumption. For the men, horses and wagons, it was pure misery. The sun was relentless, the air hung heavy, and the ground underfoot was bone dry, guaranteeing that the advance of the regiment was clearly marked by a large dust cloud rising high into the sky, while inside the woods the dust clung to man and beast and visibility resembled that of a London fog. Our destination was the village of Wielgomlini, which was finally reached at midnight. However, bedding down in an unfamiliar place in the dark of night was not a pleasant experience, especially when it was generally known that trigger-happy civilians were all about. We first placed our vehicles in hedgehog formation, then put out strong security pickets before actually enjoying a peaceful night. The following day, a day of rest, we had a good look at our surroundings and discovered we were in a largely undamaged part of the village immediately adjacent to a mill. The local population was friendly and seemed harmless. So, watched by the astonished villagers, we took the opportunity to bathe in the mill pond. This led to friendly interaction between soldiers and villagers of both sexes, and a day without incident. Early on the 8th, we moved off and headed east via Przedbos, where we crossed over the river Pilica and, at the congested village entrance, came upon an Army Corps signals unit, which at the time of mobilization had been staffed to a large extent by our people. There followed many loud and cheerful greetings, although we learned the sad details of the death of the departmental commander, a Captain Gutcher, who on 2nd of September, while out on reconnaissance, had ventured into a village still occupied by Polish troops where he and his technical inspector were killed. Of all the communities encountered so far, the village of Przedbos left us with the most depressing and wretched impression. It seemed to be home to a large Jewish population, with men all wearing the traditional black skull caps and long beards, and fat-bellied women, surrounded by countless children, hovering at every doorstep. Among the women, I saw none who might be described in the least bit attractive. On the contrary, there were many dark Mephistophelian faces reminding me of Leonardo da Vinci drawings, and the entire male population, despite the excessive heat, continued to move around in thickly padded black kaftans. The doors to the Jewish shops had been smashed, and the non-Jewish population, who had gathered in large numbers, had begun to loot, plunder, and distribute the goods amongst themselves. Although not by the men of my company, there was some rough treatment meted out to the Jews by German soldiers, such as beards partially or completely cut off, or, amid gales of laughter, men forced to throw up their right arm and shout, "Heil Hitler!" There appeared to be a general view that when dealing with Jews anything goes, an impression that either spread or had been brought in from Germany, and on several occasions I had to forcefully intervene and remind the men of the unworthiness of their behaviour. I saw it as clearly stemming from their indoctrination at the hands of the Hitler Youth and the SA, which had deliberately and knowingly encouraged such crude treatment. It was at times like these where the otherwise decent and trusted German soldier seemed to show another face which to me was both foreign and repulsive, and I was reminded of an occasion in the marketplace in Kotzines on the river Weichsel, where, having made a purchase from a Jewish shop, a couple of soldiers ran after me calling out, "Herr Oberleutnant, you don't have to pay. It's a Jewish shop." Later that afternoon, our column approached Ruda Majnieka, where, aside from a manor house and an extensive estate, not much remained other than whitewashed walls and blackened chimneys. It was all so depressing that we decided to move a kilometre northwest to a village called Waldbiwak. The warm afternoon sunshine turned the trees a reddish colour and filled the air with the smell of hot, dry pine, and from the fields, the sweet aroma of freshly cut stubble and hay drifted over to us. Above us, the treetops swayed gently in the breeze, and higher up small tufts of white clouds drifted peacefully across the deep blue sky. We were grateful for the few hours of quiet, because one never knew when there would be trouble again, and a fresh exchange of gunfire with some of the locals. Late one night, I suddenly awoke and very nearly fired off my pistol into the night. Around the tent, I had distinctly heard muffled footsteps, and even the snap ping of twigs along with breathing of living beings. Happily, the source of these nocturnal sounds turned out to have been freely roaming horses, cows, and pigs, which, unaccustomed to their new-found freedom, were more subdued than is usual for farm animals. In the early hours, we moved off over rugged roads in the general direction of Konski, which, much like many other places, was an unappealing little town. Had I, accustomed as I am to Central European standards and expectations, been compelled to live there, I would have seen it as a death sentence. I couldn't help trying to imagine what the life of a teacher or a priest might be like in Konski, whose citizens were already busy robbing their fellow Poles, streaming in from the country. The railway station, which had just been a target of the Luftwaffe, gave frightening proof of the destructiveness of bombers. Bricks, glass, bits of concrete and splintered wood lay scattered all around, and between the platforms were 3, 4 meters deep craters surrounded by twisted rails pointing skyward. Nearby, shattered goods wagons stood open and unguarded, allowing locals to plunder and loot without interference. From Konski we climbed the northwesterly foothills of the Lissa Mountains, where our route alternated on either side between stunted pine trees and empty heathland, followed by more sand and scrubland. The heat was oppressive, the wind was dead, and the entire road and surroundings were covered in dust, as if under a thick layer of baking flour. There was no greenery, no soft grass, only dust-covered grey dead plants. Now we were approaching Ruski Brod, and from afar we could already see the gleaming white church tower. Expecting to have to spend the rest of the day in the hot dust, the company was delighted to come upon two small, shimmering blue lakes and set up camp on the shore of the larger of the two. In a blink of an eye, the water was alive with buck-naked figures soaping themselves down, and then spraying and splashing each other with childlike pleasure. Even when the adjutant came rushing up to announce that a Polish airplane had attacked our route of advance, I couldn't bring myself to put an end to the fun. Bombs had killed a few horses and wounded and killed 15 soldiers belonging to our sister company. This had occurred on a section of road over which we had only just passed, but was, I believe, the very last attack by the Polish Air Force. Towards evening, when a few of the men were still in the water, shots were fired from across the fields. The men of my radio company, swimming in a pond nearest to the edge of the wood, scrambled out and were lucky to escape the hail of bullets without injury. Clothes were quickly pulled on, and preparation was made for an immediate assault on the wood, which lay approximately 1.7 kilometres distant, and from where it was believed the shots had been fired. With orders to clean out and secure the edge of the wood, and accompanied by a divisional reconnaissance unit along with strong support from a machine gun squad, we advanced towards the trees to find only abandoned enemy equipment, abandoned horses, and a few wounded Polish cavalry troops. Next day, our reconnaissance unit carried out a systematic cleansing of the entire wood, eliminating in the process a Polish cavalry unit, some of whose members had made off in the dust, but not before either setting their horses free or selling them to local farmers in exchange for civilian clothes. That night we had very little sleep. Inside the vicarage of Ruski Brod, there hung an oil painting depicting armed children defending the churchyard. This I saw as a sign of how passionate the hatred was for us, an understandable emotion only a fool could ignore. If one country elects to use powerful means to defend itself, then it must be logically expected that the other side will resort to similar action as a countermeasure. Besides the painting, members of our staff discovered among the priests' many papers a number of photographs depicting young local women in various stages of undress. On the 10th, the stop and start march continued through the wooded foothills of the Lissa Gora, passing through Przysucia, another squalid nest like the Others, and on towards Radom. On one of our dead on our feet halts, we discovered it was a Sunday, which was soon confirmed by the sight of country women, prayer books in hand, shuffling into a church service. Clad in fresh white dresses and wearing coloured headscarves of bright red, canary yellow and deep blue, they seemed to be an almost futile attempt to soften the impact of desolation created by the grey, wide-open, monotonous landscape. Amidst all this coming and going, there remained a milling mass of exhausted refugees painting a scene of confusion, stoicism, laughter, tears and anger at the apparent indifference of the well-fed villagers. With a mixture of envy and deep sadness, a refugee woman stared up at the sun and demanded to know how it could continue to cast such bright light onto so much misery. A little further on, much to our surprise, young girls who didn't appear in any way to be Volksdeutsche showered us with flowers. At the same time, farmers, to our left and right, were busy corralling free-roaming or partially hobbled Polish army horses, which, when captured, were mounted, and then, with jackets and elbows flapping, they galloped their quarry triumphantly back to their farms. The roads were so packed with traffic that in the end we gave up the notion of reaching Radom in daylight and settled down for supper in the ditch. This move had been strongly suggested by our Minister of Rations, whose real occupation was driving our jeep. Sitting beside him in the vehicle, I saw a man with a curiously slave profile, a short upturned nose, high cheekbones and small smiling eyes. Added to that, he sported a crisp blonde-red beard, which he was required to keep due to a skin infection, but which gave him even more of a Russian appearance. His name was Holzenkampfer, and he presided over the most important container in our vehicle, one into which our daily food supply disappeared and where our bread rations were stored. Thanks to his resourcefulness and energy, and in anticipation of future lean periods, he always maintained a well-provisioned food reserve. Only I and the hatchet faced bleach-blonde signals NCO, a man with whom one could readily steal horses, were only allowed a passing glimpse at Holzenkampfer's meal preparation, which was carried out by him first driving the jeep onto a level spot near a wood or a ditch, opening the side storage door and throwing a rough tablecloth over it, the last giving the gesture a slightly ceremonial air. Following that, he would lay out a board with bread, pour out the tea or coffee, and produce dripping cheese and stolen tomatoes. After enjoying a leisurely meal, the two others would light up a cigarette or a pipe and engage in cheerful banter. At times such as these, no orders from above were allowed to disturb us, unless of course we were suddenly faced with an onrushing Polish cavalry charge. Our turning in at night assumed much the same sort of ceremonial routine. Holzenkampfer also quickly proved his resourcefulness in other ways by responding to my wish to augment our meagre weapons supply with a Polish Browning machine gun. He had scouted out the entire company before proudly returning with the weapon, and we celebrated this valuable acquisition with a splendid breakfast. Within a matter of days, we had accumulated 800 rounds of machine gun ammunition from Polish ammunition pouches lying on the ground, and day after day this weapon proved its value, giving us the added comfort of knowing we possessed deadlier firepower than before. Our approach to the city of Radom took place in the dark. The division was ordered to deploy towards the southeast to prevent a breakout of superior Polish forces. My company was ordered to take up a position at the southeast part of town, while the divisional command post was to be established at Lugojo. Thus began the challenging task of leading my company in one sweep in pitch darkness through unfamiliar streets to our pre-designated quarters. Thanks to the detail of an excellent map with a scale of 100,000, I was able to successfully bring it off, and upon reaching the divisional command post, my column took up position alongside a line of German army trucks and settled in for the night. An attempt to sleep in the jeep was a failure, so stiff and cramped, I emerged to discover a tent set up by construction troops in the narrow space between us and the column of huge army trucks. My flashlight exposed the tent entrance, so in I went, mindful, however, of the close proximity and intimidating height of the nearby trucks. During the night, the truck convoy started up with a mighty roar and began to move out, causing me to dream that the drivers might not see the tiny tent and drive right over me. The result was me yelling, "Careful, careful," and shooting straight up, causing tent, pegs and ropes to fly off in all directions. The other occupants of the tent, finding themselves sleeping under open skies and feeling the chill, demanded sleepily to know what the fuss was all about. A squad leader, a young and intelligent NCO called Hedas, son of a hamburger wholesale merchant, immediately saw the situation, and within minutes the tent was restored to its former place. Next morning we all nearly died laughing over the retelling of the night's episode. Our NCO Balson, too, possessed nightly urges to wander, and while still in his sleep he would sometimes get up and venture out in one direction or another, calling out loudly, "Halt! Halt!" The following morning, we learned that those enemy units still facing the division were already in the process of dispersing, and our next deployment was to be towards the north in the direction of Radom. Under the same sweltering sun of days past, we entered the city and marvelled at its curious blend of Western-style affluence and squalid Eastern poverty. Government buildings, many dating from the days when Poland was still part of Greater Russia, onion-domed churches and handsome private dwellings, stood surrounded by a wide circle of 1 or 2 storied primitive dwellings. These were typical, low-slung wooden homes with roofs of wood shingles or sheets of corrugated iron. It appeared that whatever the Poles had built in recent years was done with complete disregard for any form of city planning and consideration as to how it might fit in with nearby architecture. Newer buildings consisted largely of American-style square box-like buildings, plain grey and white with flat roofs, or if unfinished, in some cases no roof at all. The railway station, which had been heavily damaged, presented a gruesome picture, not only for the blackened corpses of dead railway workers who had the misfortune of being at work during the time of the raid, but also for the indescribable damage caused by the bombs. Entire railway carriages had been overturned by the force of the blasts, others reduced to nothing more than the wheels with the superstructures thrown to all 4 corners and twisted rails pointing either straight up or bent back 180 degrees. The station buildings had all either been razed to the ground or turned into blackened, burned-out shells, while the few bombs that had fallen into neighbouring streets had shattered windows and thrown dirt and clay up against grimy white walls. To our amazement, we noted how the bodies of the dead were a source of great morbid curiosity for the women and children. In the early afternoon, we set off at pace along what was finally a good road, the big Warsaw Highway, to the north, and having followed it for about 13 kilometers, set up camp in the town of Jedlinsk. In the meadows of Radomka there was an ideal place from which to dispatch a few telephone and radio construction squads, while the company, in the main, remained at rest. The speed and the fast-changing direction of our advance made it obvious that nearly all communication ought to be via radio, which was both quicker and required less manpower. By now, the personal war of potshot ambushes and suicidal razor-blade attacks had ceased, and searching the male population no longer produced hidden firearms or switchblade razors, ready to cut up the unsuspecting investigating soldiers. Nonetheless, numerous stories still abounded of suicidal attacks made by prisoners thought to have been disarmed, but those were, for the most part, greatly exaggerated. It was now a war mostly against individual Polish units representing the remains of a division or a regiment, which, led by determined officers, continued to carry out recklessly brave attempts at a breakout. The enemy's main objective was a stretch of dense forest immediately in front of us, which began about 5 kilometers north of Jedlinsk, and reached in a wide circle towards the northeast, almost touching the banks of the river Weichsel. The average width of this stretch of forest was about 2 to 3 kilometers, and its length ran for 20 to 30 kilometers. In the stifling heat of the morning of the 12th of September, while negotiating our way along bottomless sand roads, the regiment's infantry worked its way north towards the forest. Clearing the enemy from the wood went off without a hitch, and motorized units of the division were able to reach Głowaczo via Radom and Kozienice, along a roughly paved road. In the afternoon heat, we returned to Radom, where at the northern entrance to the town, in an extensive industrial area, we bypassed a prisoner of war camp. There we saw a mass of earth-brown uniforms without a single splash of colour of either leather gear or rank insignia. Most of the faces showed a dull indifference, and everyone appeared to have lost all interest in military discipline and dress, while on the German side of the wire truck-mounted searchlights gave proof of guards all around. On a pothole-filled road between Radom and Kozienice, our column came across an abandoned Polish field kitchen which had lost one of its wheels. It took us 5 minutes to retrieve the wheel that lay in the ditch, reattach it to the axle, grease it up and hitch it to one of our carriers, which then, in a slow and gentle drive, brought it carefully back to camp. The recovery of the field kitchen took us all of 5 minutes, from which one can only surmise that the Poles, in their haste to retreat, didn't even have that much time. Upon entering the huge forest southwest of Kozienice, which at the time was a refuge for countless Polish troops who had become separated from their senior units, we could see that the retreat had in places turned into an outright rout. How many had surrendered during the clearing operation one could only guess, but all kinds of equipment lay in the ditches and on both sides of the road. These included Browning machine guns, ammunition and signals equipment, and when exploring the forest cuttings, we frequently caught sight of an abandoned artillery piece or an exhausted horse wandering aimlessly around. At the edge of a ford stood a mangled mess of prime movers and heavy anti-aircraft machine gun carriers, all of which had been driven into each other. These were quickly and thoroughly inspected by our men in search of anything useful, and our signals and radio senior sergeants and drivers very quickly developed the skills to speedily salvage bits and pieces such as batteries, tyres and more. The few villages within the forest soon became small German islands where battle vehicles were repaired in the shade of the trees and between the houses, while watchful sentries were posted at all village entrances and exits. From out in the open, I was able to gaze over the treetops into the valley of the river Weichsel, where dark silver-lined thunderclouds hung ominously overhead. Kozienice, which lies some 7–10 kilometers this side of the river, is a dump like so many other places, except it possessed a tennis court and a castle, giving it a fleeting air of an East Prussian town. Days later, I drove back into the town's geometrically laid-out market square to buy fruit and butter, and found the castle burned to the ground. It was rumoured to have been torched by the locals, which, if true, deprived many a divisional staff of comfortable quarters. The marketplace was home to crowds of men and women, some of whom were Volksdeutsche farm women who, tall, blonde and blue-eyed, speedily sold their wares to our soldiers. By now we were all dreaming of a bath. A merciless sun has made us giddy and parched, and the dust has found its way into every opening in our clothes, ground between our teeth and into our eyes, which are no more than slits in a dust-encrusted face. The dream begins with a tub of hot water, in which we stretch our weary limbs to be followed by a vigorous rub down and massage, and the application of some sort of soothing body lotion. All of that would of course be full load by a sit-down meal at a white linen-covered table, to await an appetizer of toasted white bread with anchovies, and an egg washed down by a glass of sweet liqueur. Next would come a cold soup and Melba toast, fish cooked generously in oil, and a green salad. Not content with that, we would expect a meat course with asparagus, fresh peas, all to be liberally accompanied by bread and butter, and finally for dessert a multiple choice of cheeses, fruitcake, and coffee. When, about a year later, I first became acquainted with French cooking, I often reflected how inadequately amateurish our food fantasies had then been. The village of Bezuza and estate were undamaged, and so became divisional headquarters for the next few days, whereas my company's camp was 2 kilometers away in the village of Gloazzo. Most of the place had been reduced to a heap of rubble, and what wasn't damaged were a few filthy clapboard shacks. Luckily, we discovered a relatively clean farm nearby where we made ourselves comfortable in the yard and barns. When, next day, the temperature fell and it began to rain, the tents were packed away, and everyone crept into the straw-filled barns. The division, we were advised, would stay put and engage in mopping up enemy elements within the Kocinice, Pilika River mouth Jedlinsk triangle, allowing 2 light infantry divisions, spearheading the first wave of attack, to be withdrawn. In the centre of the triangle lay the above-described forest, an area that would keep us occupied for the next little while. The mopping-up operation involved widely spread-out infantry regiments with artillery and engineers, all of whom would finally have need of our telephone services. While Regiment 42 operated to the south of the forest, Regiment 72, moving from Grabo, a village on the far side, began its mopping up by approaching from the north. Along the infantry regiment 72 line of communication, Brzuza, Glowachov, Grabov, there ran a relatively good road which split the forest in 2, one part to the west and the other running alongside the river Weichsel. The first attack was made on this latter section by both regiments along with horse-drawn artillery, however fewer prisoners were bagged there than expected. It was once again a stiflingly hot afternoon, and the dead straight cuttings revealed a forest thick with underbrush concealing everything beyond a few meters on either side. The dust-coated leaves were brittle and hard as stones. The encrusted telephone cables were often impossible to see, and only here and there a thin and level line could be spotted running through the trees. Before the mopping-up crews drew level, there was little to be seen, only a few dust-encrusted soldiers with machine guns guarding intersecting cuttings, and here and there a handful of Polish prisoners watched over by a solitary trooper. Only briefly did we linger at forest-cutting intersections, watched over by abandoned Polish artillery pieces, with breech blocks removed and the sad sight of frightened horses, some still in harness and attached to a machine gun or ammunition tender. Having traversed the full width of the forest, we finally arrived at the regimental command post, only to find it was on the move again. Nearby stood a burned-out German armoured car, along with the Polish gun that had knocked it out. An upturned Polish regimental clerk's desk presented a wild mass of papers from which we salvaged maps and forms. Upon our return at dusk through the forest, a lieutenant begged us to take some of his prisoners with us, as he, with a mere handful of men, was incapable of guarding the lot, so we set off with 2 Polish officers and a wounded soldier. The lieutenant had also asked us to pass on the word that in his area of the wood there were 4 heavy-caliber Polish guns, with likely more situated deeper in the forest. In the yard of a small farm at the forest edge there were mounds of abandoned military equipment. Piled together were ammunition boxes, many bearing multicoloured danger markings, ammunition belts, light and heavy machine guns, some of which were from old German stock of 1918-19, handguns, overcoats, gas masks, trenching tools and brown Polish steel helmets. We reached Gloazo in darkness, having bypassed several columns of ex-horsted prisoners, stumbling along in their earth-brown uniforms. The two assault regiments reached the overgrown banks of the river Weichsel, where there were sharp exchanges with scattered Polish units. An advanced artillery reconnaissance troop described in lively fashion how it all went down. Apparently the Poles, finding themselves cornered, had counter-attacked with reckless bravery. In the early morning hours, the men of a telephone squad belonging to my company were very nearly ambushed in their vehicles. The heavy Adler truck was cold and wouldn't start, and was about to be overtaken by Polish infantrymen when the other vehicle came to life and fired at the enemy, who had strangely not thought to fire first. That was how my men made good their escape. On the following day, one of our telephone repair crews, working on a damaged line running across our section of the forest, reported that the enemy, in reinforced battalion strength, had crossed the main highway from east to west. Indeed, a strong Polish presence was soon detected in the western area towards Jedlinsk, an area thought to have already been cleared. I had been of the firm impression that all was quiet, so this piece of news seemed to be highly unreliable, yet, when a strong force set out to re-clear the area, it was greeted by gunfire. Because one of our telephone lines crossed the edge of the wood, the men of the repair crew were confronted with a number of adventures, one of which occurred when, at a distance of about 100 meters, a whole row of brown figures suddenly rose up from the shrubbery with their hands in the air. Because, in their excitement, it wasn't immediately clear that they wanted to surrender, the first reaction of my men was to throw themselves down and begin to shoot. The Poles threw themselves to the ground again, following which our men rose up and advanced towards the spot where the enemy had disappeared from view, only to see the Poles stand up again, compelling ours to fling themselves down a second time. This strange game finally ended when the prisoners were finally marched away, but one was reminded of occasions when Polish soldiers had stood up with hands raised only to have their fellow countrymen fire upon those approaching to round them up. Later, on a dry, sunny afternoon in the vicinity of a forester's house, we got a stark reminder of how effective the work of our engineers could be. Our telephone line had been severed, and while engineers were hard at work nearby, our signals repairmen went out in search of the break. First, the cable in vicinity of the forester's home had to be found, and the work crew edged along the narrow track running along the forest perimeter with its big diesel truck, until the technicians discovered bits and pieces of wire strung across the lane with one end hidden by the slats of a picket fence. Curious to find out where the cable led, the men descended from the truck only to discover a bundle of live hand grenades concealed behind the fence. They had been put there by our engineers and were intended as a surprise for the Poles. Luckily, the wheels of the truck missed the tripwire, and my men escaped a very nasty fate. Yet another cut to the telephone line brought us out of bed at a very early hour. This time, we dared not enter the wood with our vehicle and left it parked at the edge, leaving Lieutenant Knopfer and me to investigate the cause of the communications failure on foot. The wind gusted heavily, and the rain trickled down my neck. At the roadside, we came upon a small group of our soldiers, with collars raised, engaged in agitated conversation.